Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Coates. I'm the host of the Live Free and Die Hard podcast, episode number 315. Welcome, and welcome to my friend Brad Dieter. He's been on a bunch of times before. If you're not familiar with him and you're a newer listener, well, he's a PhD. He's a really smart guy, one of my favorite humans in the industry, to be quite honest. And he's the co-owner and CEO of Macros Inc. And he is someone I like to hear his thoughts about cutting edge topics. I asked him, some stuff he was interested in talking about. He gave me some good ones. And he's also a speaker at my event. I'm going to shout that out right now for the people who don't listen to the very end. September 13th, 14th, here in Edmonton, Alberta. I'm doing my event again in partnership with Evolve Strength, Evolve Strength Business and Coaching Conference. And Brad, I'm really glad you'll be there. And I guess there'd be a big cohort of Macros Inc. coaches coming, right?
Yes, we should be rolling out pretty deep. So, first off, Andrew, thanks for having me back on. It's always great to connect with you. Really appreciate you saying that I'm one of your favorite people. That means more to me than all the industry chops. So I appreciate that, and excited to be here. Yeah, and actually super excited for the conference. It's been a little bit since I've spoken at a big conference, just with how busy life has been. So this is I'm excited to connect with everybody, and it'll be a fun time. So if you haven't signed up, go sign up.
And we have virtual too. So if you can't make it to Edmonton, we have virtual options. So message me. I mean it because I remember I would have met you 2018, the first year that I went to the Inland Empire Fitness Conference where you were
Yep.
speaking. You've been a speaker there every year. And I kept coming back until Tim turned around. He's like, hey man, I actually got a notification on Facebook today. It was like the 3-year anniversary of being announced as a speaker at this event. And that was my first speaking thing. But even when I went there as an attendee, didn't know a lot of people. You're one of the speakers. You're gracious, personable, polite, pleasant. Like there's no ego, there's no chip on your shoulder. And while I find that more of the speakers in the industry kind of are like that versus, people with these fragile egos, those fragile egos are still there. And sometimes people walk around with with that little bit of air under their feet and they think they're better than other people.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that's always been interesting to me is we're in a profession that's all about helping other people. Like we're serving clients primarily, right? Whether you build a massive business or you're doing one-on-one, and part of service is like your peers, right? And part of service is like meeting people where they're at. Everybody's the same, like try to connect with people. So that's kind of always been my viewpoint of like how do you build a long career?
You actually queued that one up. The power of a long career and a good network. And I think that's actually a good question to go right into. And like, why does this matter? I think there's a lot of coaches who probably go in thinking, well, and you know what? I'll say this in a different context. I used to work in a commercial gym. I'm still in sort of a public gym space, but and with the other trainers in that space, I tried to generally get along with some of them. Some of them were just abhorrent and unethical. But when it came to the company and my manager, my rule always was my business is not a team sport. Now, when it's come to the industry, I'm completely the other way. I actually really want to help, support, educate, do anything I can to keep people in the industry because I know how good the industry's been to me and I want to give back. So, but for the coach who is still very much focused on their own livelihood and maybe they're struggling a little bit, why would you say to them, hey, listen, your network within the industry, this stuff matters?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the industry is very big, right? I mean, there's 150 million people just in the United States that need the services that we provide, right? So it's super big in that aspect. So there's way more clients to go around than we can actually serve, right? So it's really about how do you develop the skills to go get the clients that you need to build a livelihood. The second side of that is kind of on the flip side. The industry is also super, super small, like very small, right? The people who've been around for forever and who are kind of the still some of the bigger names. I mean, like I had a conversation with Jordan Sayat the other day, and like him and I did a podcast together in 2011, like when he was still in school, like he had just finished, nobody knew who he was. I was in grad school, nobody knew who I was, and like, you know, I can still pick up the phone and get a hold of him and we have a good relationship, right? Like, I've never asked him for anything, but it's like it's such a small industry. And I just got back from Phoenix. I was doing some work and we were doing a video shoot for a project I was working on. And it was kind of last minute and they needed some kind of coaches to be on camera to record some stuff. And I had a few friends that live in Phoenix. I just picked up the phone. I mean, they're quote unquote competitors of mine. But I just picked up the phone and called them and said, "Hey, like, would you be interested and willing to do this?" And so they came in, and it was good work for them, and they made good connections. And it's just the more that we can prop up other people is really how we're gonna kind of win this long term battle of like trying to get people to reprioritize things and really actually provide good quality coaching and service to people. So I think it's just really adopt the mindset of all ships rise with the tide.
And if I'm not mistaken, you've always had a good relationship with Mike Dola, who is the owner, founder of like probably your most direct competitor in Stronger You. Now he's exited and he's doing his own thing, but you guys have always been great, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've never, it's funny. Mike and I, we met in person for the first time at the IAFC conference. It must have been 2019,
Mhm.
2021, something like that. I can't remember exactly what year it was. But we got pictures together. Mike and I've always got along online. Like we don't interact a ton, but we've always had a great relationship in terms of like when we have connected. So yeah.
And I'm here's another aspect of it. I'm actually enriched by my friends, by my interactions with people who are in the industry all over the world, right?
Yeah.
I find a lot more kindred spirits. Like I've got some friends locally who are great. My former co-host Dean Guido, for example, but Guido's also busy with like family life and all that. So I don't get to see him very often. But when you travel and you drop into a room of people who have similar passions and you're inspired by and you're learning from, nothing has done more for my career. And as much as the trips to conferences, especially if I'm speaking, it's busy. There's a lot going on, and you get really up, and of course you're exhausted afterwards. You get amped up and exhausted, but they're fulfilling, and you kind of think for 2 weeks, like, all right, I don't want to travel again for 2 years, and then week 3, week 4, and you can't wait for the next one, and you go to see everybody again.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of like whenever you finish a big project, or like a book or something, you're like, I'm never doing this again. And then 3 weeks later, you forget the pain of what it felt like, and you're like, oh yeah, I want to do this again. And then you get started, and you're like, God, why do I keep doing this to myself?
Let's do the AI thing because it's a topic of conversation.
Yeah,
It's on people's minds. It's the sort of thing that I absolutely expect you're probably forward thinking on. And I mean, I have a lot of thoughts, but I haven't immersed myself too much. I mean, I definitely figure there are going to be people, there are already people who are using it to maybe misrepresent what's theirs and what's, AI's. What are your feelings on that? What's ethical? What do you think is unethical? How can it help good coaches? What are the problematic shortcuts people are going to take? How do we tease out the nuance of that?
yeah. So I think there's actually two major veins to kind of push this discussion through. One is kind of the questions that you asked, and then one is I think an actual larger perspective in terms of value and commoditization that people aren't maybe quite aware of yet. So let's start with the first one because I think that's the more short term thing. Obviously, I think the big thing is making sure that what you're selling is what you're selling, right? So if you are selling individualized one on one coaching, but you're having AI run most of the actual like reading client responses, replying, stuff like that, I think you just need to be very upfront and honest. Depending on the quality of coaching, the AI may be better than the coaching service you're providing, right? So in some cases, it may be a better service, but just be upfront and honest with it. I think that's the big thing. Two, one of my immediate concerns is scope of practice and liability, right? And we've had this discussion quite a bit internally in some of the advisory boards I sit on. The way the laws are structured, especially in the United States, is only registered dietitians can provide meal plans, right?
You know what? Goob actually, if you like Goob actually had gone into the legislation on that. And as like the way he presented it, and again, he went to law school, he quote sort of debunked that in this context. He basically, I mean, you'd have to go back to post, but he actually went after both Sohee Lee and Jonathan Goodman, who made that claim publicly in posts, and they both just ignored him. And he went in, and I think he only found a couple of states that had like some very specific legislation on it. There was nothing federally. So that one's kind of a weird one for me, and I don't want anybody
Yes.
to get on Goog's radar about that.
Yeah. So I mean, there's I mean, from a legal perspective, in terms of like what state law is, there may be some validity there because I haven't looked at exactly the state legislation, but I've looked at scope of practice regarding like medical malpractice, right, which is very
Right.
different than state legislation.
Mhm.
So he's probably 100% right. But so the point I was trying to get to is like as like a certified nutrition coach, you really can't slash shouldn't be providing meal plans, right? But you can ask AI to do it,
Mhm. Mm.
and then you can say, well, I didn't do it, AI did it. And then where is the like the actual liability lie? And so I think there's going to be a lot of things like that that have to be teased out in terms of legal and responsibility. And I think that's something that we're going to have to figure out. I mean, to your point, every state's different,
Mm.
right? And so just trying to sort that out is a really big piece. And then the third piece, kind of in the more local context, is do you just blindly trust it to get it right?
Mm.
Right. So either you're just gonna let these AI things run and do your coaching for you, or you're gonna have to fact check everything. Like I don't know what is going on with Google, but their generative AI is so bad. Like if you like Google something and you just see the generative AI summary, like my wife did something the other day and it spit out an answer. It was like smoking up to 3 packs a day of cigarettes is safe. Like it somehow made something up crazy. She showed it to me when she was looking at something for work, and I was like, "This is wild." So you just like there's these issues that are very kind of local to what's going on right now that I think we just as practitioners have to be super aware of. Um, but one of the larger things that I'm not sure if a lot of people are thinking about is the way that almost all of these large AI models are built is they are all going to converge on the same answers, right? Because it's basically based on the amount of data that it's trained on. And if they're all trained on all of the internet on or all the data on the internet, like every AI is going to be the same, right? There may be some nuances of like the tonality of the language and things like that, but effectively they're all if you ask it a question, they're all going to give you the same answer because they're all trained on the same data. So you're basically just going to commoditize AI coaching and everything's going to be the same. Like whether you have, the open AI chat GPT, you ask a question in there or you ask it in your business, like it's going to give you the same answer because it's all trained on the same data. So unless people have, very large data sets that are specific to their business and they train them on just that, they're all going to be the same.
Important note, when I'm quote challenging sort of the legal statement, number one is I don't think the overwhelming majority of coaches should be giving meal plans, right? Like the ethical side of that stuff, I think most are going to be unqualified to do it. I think you're getting into pitfalls. I think that is really important to state. Nor do I do it myself, nor do I want to. I just wanted to kind of like throw that out there because I've actually seen someone go in. Anyway, so I've addressed that. I also remember I was playing around with Chat GPT when it first came out. I've done minimal with it. And I was asking questions about like things that I knew explicitly. And there's a band that I love, and I asked her, "What are the members of this band?" And it spit out the names, and there were at least a couple of members that at one point or another were part of the band were missing this. I said, and I'm having a conversation with, well, and this person is in the band. It's like, oh yes, you're right. Blah blah blah. This person is in the band. It's like and that's an earlier model of it, but it seems to be error prone. Almost reminds me of listening to um, PhDs who are very like public communicators of science. Let's say Neil deGrasse Tyson or Rhonda Patrick or Huberman gets a lot of shit for this. And within their area of expertise, they're extremely qualified. Neil deGrasse Tyson, astrophysicist. But then I remember Neil popped up one time and said something about nutrition that was so astonishingly wrong, but I happen to know that stuff. So, but most people don't know these topics they're talking about, so they sound perfectly authoritative and not authoritarian, authoritative and smart, and like they don't even question stuff. This is actually the literal problem with these type of individuals. And so I think we're also going to most people are still going to take things that ChatGPT or OpenAI or whatever like spit out, and they're just going to take it as gospel. So do you think it ever will reach a point where it's trustworthy?
Um, I mean, I think eventually, right? But even then, if they stay on the current trend they're on, it's all probabilistic. So there's always some error in there, right? But I mean, that's humans too, right? We have error.
What about, I mean, this is a tricky one. I usually try to stay away from ideological shit, but what about a lot of the concerns about who are the people who are programming this stuff and their sort of like socio-political ideological bent? And what if we get people who are feeding things into it that, oh, there's no relationship between your degree of adiposity and your long-term health outcomes, which we know is verifiably false based on, decades of medical data.
Yeah, that's the other issue, right? Is most of these things are like they require human feedback to like tune them. So if you have certain people running those things, it's going to be trained into, one area versus another. So that's going to be another big issue that we're going to face is like who's controlling that. I mean, we've already seen that with all the stuff going on. I mean, we it hasn't, at least I haven't seen it in the nutrition stuff that I've looked up, but like you see it in everything else. So that's already an issue.
What was it? What was it? Google's Gemini would not put white people as historical figures, and they were making
Yeah.
black Nazis, like just crazy shit like that.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that also is the sort of thing that the grifters, the right wing talking heads tend to like over
Yeah.
amplify too. But it seems to also be legitimate.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think the other thing too is like realistically, for what our clients need, the AI tools are not that much different than just a quick Google search. Like our clients already have access to like just searching Google, right? All AI does is like take those Google searches and compress it into a paragraph. So they actually end up doing a little bit less due diligence on their own and get answers faster. But it's really not that much more of a value add in terms of like what it's doing.
So what you're saying is it's not Skynet. It's just a really, really advanced, super powerful pattern recognition algorithm aggregator of existing data at this point.
Yeah, I mean that's also I think what AI will probably be for the next several decades.
So we don't have to worry about John Connor and the Terminator and all this sort of stuff.
I mean, a part of me hopes that's what we go to because like it'd be kind of cool to just like have no more chronic life stress. We don't pay taxes anymore. It's the end of the world. We just survive. We're out hunting food. I mean, that'd be kind of a fun time to
Fallout,
live through.
like Fallout.
Yeah. Although
Oh,
my wife's comment every time I bring up how awesome the zombie apocalypse is, she always says, "If there's no target around, I don't want to live through it."
we had Target come up here. This is totally off topic, side quest. Come up to Canada, bought up a whole bunch of big leases in malls, and they didn't have the supply chain availability. The quality wasn't there, and they bombed up here. They failed.
Yeah, doesn't surprise me.
Same thing happened with Whole Foods. I think they came, actually, I think they pulled out before they opened up. They realized that we just do not have the supply chain to be able to actually stock these things.
Is it because of the logistics getting stuff across the border or
I don't know if it's the border per se, but it's, yeah, I think with Whole Foods, the sourcing of enough things sort of like semi-local, I guess, is probably one of
yeah.
the issues. We're way off topic here. I'm going to draw you back in because that's my I'm Geralting, I'm side questing here. Witcher fans. Okay, so another one that's, and any more thoughts on AI, like fire them away. But the other one that I know is a big, big hot topic now is Ozempic, GLP-1 agonist drugs. What do the coaches need to understand? Because I see people both, I see the people who, a lot of shame-based language saying this is cheating, this is not the answer, blah, blah, blah. I think I can't really get on board with that. But yeah, what do you think about it?
Yeah. So I think you brought up a good point. I think there are two ends of the spectrum. I think there's, one end where it's kind of the shame based, this is cheating. I think there's the other side where it's like, hey, there's nothing wrong with these. They're like these new medical breakthroughs. Everybody should be on them. They're meant to be lifetime medications anyway. Um, and I think the actual answer and how we're gonna effectively navigate this is somewhere in the middle, right? As with all things. The first thing I think to say about this is although these drugs appear to be more effective than ones previously, they're not new and they're not really novel in terms of how they work, right? We have seen the appetite suppressant medications for the last 30 years, right? And what was really interesting to me is when the original studies came out, after kind of the initial diabetes efficacy studies when they were actually starting to be used for going through the weight loss like FDA approval pathway, the weight loss and weight rebound graphs looked identical to the weight loss drugs in the 90s, right? Now, these have the benefit of having additional glycemic control instead of just kind of like central nervous system appetite suppressant, but the graphs look the exact same, right? Basically, you're on medications that lower hunger, they lower your drive to eat, you eat a lot less food, you lose a lot of weight, you remove the medication, all that comes back, and you start slowly gaining weight until you're almost back to normal, right? So it's not new, right? This has been around for forever. I think the difference is one, these medications have a massive amount of money and resources behind them. They're now in an era where marketing, social media is really driving them being used a lot more than the historical ones were. And I think the fact that they are quite a bit more effective in terms of like absolute weight loss than like the earlier generation is having a lot more people use them. So I think we're going to be seeing a lot of people use them, whether they use them for a long time or a short time. It's really going to come down to us as practitioners finding ways to navigate that with our clients. And from what I've seen, at least from the data and then from some of the conversations we've had with clients over the last like year or so with these, my big focus with these clients is, one, whether it's you're working with us during the process or after the process, my big concern is the preservation of lean mass tissue with these clients. I know that there's been people who've said like, hey, it's really not that big of a deal. My concern is less in the short term and more in the long term, right? We know that people after the age of about 35 lose, I can't remember the exact number, like it's almost like, is it like 8 to 10% of muscle mass per decade over the age of 35, right? So let's
Roughly.
say you take somebody and they lose 40, 50 pounds, which is great from like a longevity perspective in terms of reducing overall mortality risk, right? So like if you lose that much weight, you have a massive reduction in risk. That's awesome. The downside is if you've lost 15 pounds or so of lean mass during that process, because that's about the ratio, right? 30 to 40, 45% of it, if you're not engaging in exercise, that's like several decades of muscle mass loss. Like you've accelerated your age related decline in muscle tissue by several decades. So for me, that like as practitioners, we need to focus on like, okay, either how do we slow that during the medication use or after, like how do we try to rebuild some of that tissue, even if it's 5, 6 pounds over the course of 3 or 4 years, like you've bought a decade back. So I think that's a big part of it that we need to make sure that we focus on. The other piece is as the weight rebound comes back, your body composition is going to be worse than when you started, right? So you're going to have less muscle tissue and you're going to have the same amount of body weight. So your overall metabolic sink that you have in your muscle tissue is lower. Your overall risk goes actually higher than it was at baseline. So we just need to find ways to maintain that weight loss and try to build some of that muscle tissue. That's the big concern that I have as a practitioner of like, okay, how do we take this and take the good and kind of try to eliminate the long-term negative side effects?
And you know what this is exactly the same as? People who do aggressive yo-yo fad diets for a period of time and only go back to the original behavior. It functions in terms of the muscle loss, it functions almost identically. I mean, so
Yeah. And
it,
what's interesting is, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to
I was going to say,
interrupt you.
what's the intervention? The intervention is, I mean, its most simple form is just get people resistance training.
Yeah. And what's really interesting about the medications is there's no clear mechanisms that suggests that they accelerate muscle mass loss independent of just the like overt calorie restriction, right? There's been a couple papers that suggest maybe they help preserve lean mass loss like mechanistically and like some cell culture models and some animal models, but I don't think it really translates to humans. It's really just when you cut your intake by 800 to 1200 calories a day, like that's just what tends to happen.
And in practical terms, which macronutrient is often the one that when you're not hungry, if you're not thinking about food, a lot of the people who I've heard talk about this, Dr. Crystal Guevara has been really good about this. She's speaking again this year, and last year she did a presentation on Ozempic and these drugs, and they describe when they're using it that there's the food noise is either less or gone, and like they go from always thinking about food to it not being present. But if you have a significant suppression of your appetite, what are you probably less likely to want to eat? A chicken breast, right? You probably may still find that the hyperpalatable, higher calorie stuff is still a little bit easier to go down, but I don't know. I don't think there's any data on this. I haven't seen any, but I would suspect that, something like a very filling baked potato or maybe a steak or, a chicken breast or whatever may simply just be like, oh, I don't have the appetite for this. So do you have any data? Have you seen any trends where people are eating less protein as a greater proportion of the reduced calorie intake?
I actually looked into this because we wrote a position stand for NASM, I don't know, maybe a year ago. Maybe I think it was that long ago. And I actually tried to look into this data to see if I could find any. And as of about a year ago, there wasn't any good, clear information um, that actually showed that. One of the thought processes I have is we also know that these medications in a lot of people slow like gastric emptying, right? And generally speaking, dietary protein ends up being one of the macronutrients. That cat's so awesome. Macronutrients that is a little bit more difficult to digest. And so there's also part of me that thinks food selection may also be affected by how their like GI tract is responding to food interactions with these medications. So I think that's also going to be a big part of it.
It makes sense, and I'd love to see more data. I think it's probably something that people should keep top of mind, so that way either they're conscientious of making sure they're getting adequate protein, which is going to play a role in maintaining lean mass. I guess there's another consideration, and I'd like to hear your analysis on this. But when we have someone, even if they're resistance training, who is a significant weight loss client, even if you're quote preserving muscle mass with resistance training, you're going to lose some muscle mass as a proportion of your weight loss
Yeah.
because, as I understand it correctly, like structurally, people who are carrying around a lot of weight every day, structurally, they're going to have muscle in certain places, probably their legs, hips, core, torso, uh, that just supports that weight. So is
Yep.
that true?
Yes. Yeah, 100%. I think the goal is really to just try to minimize as much of it as you can, right? I mean, if you lose 100 pounds over the next 10 years of your life, you're probably going to continue to lose a little bit of that muscle tissue because your body's just slowly adapting to carrying less weight, right? But I think the goal is like, how do you minimize that as much as possible?
And I guess the idea there is to let coaches know, listening, not to be alarmed if there is some loss of
Yeah.
lean mass, right? Like I do not believe in the case of someone with significant weight to lose, that you're going to be able to avoid any loss of lean muscle. And you may ultimately go in phases as well, where the focus is losing mass overall, calorie deficit, and then later on, you get someone in a maintenance phase or whatever, or even they're lean enough they want to start building muscle again. You can build some of that muscle back up again, probably in different places.
Yeah. And I think, if you just do the math on it, like let's say you've got a client who loses 100 pounds, which is aggressive but reasonable for somebody who weighs 300 pounds. If they lose without intervention, they lose 40 pounds of lean mass. With an intervention, they lose 20%. So that's 20. I mean, a 20-pound difference is massive. That's like, depending on your weight, like that is a decade of age related losses in muscle tissue. So you've saved your client a decade of their life, basically. And so I mean, even just small differences like that make a huge difference in the long run.
Where are we on the ability for the drug companies to create supply? Because the other thing you hear sometimes from people is that they balk at the fact that people are doing this for cosmetic reasons, or people who are not diabetics because this is quote a diabetic medication. As I understand it, isn't there a medication, a version of it that's meant for the general population? I have one thought on this. If people are using it, we'll say responsibly, and that's a nebulous term in this context, but it keeps someone who is progressing to gain weight from getting into pre-diabetic and diabetic stages, and therefore there's a lot less cost to the healthcare system, and taxing on their system. They're basically dealing with this upstream. I see that still as a good thing, and almost like a net equal, to a dealing with it while someone's already diabetic.
Yeah, so I think you raised a great point, right? And this kind of goes back a little bit to my comment earlier, like the effects that they have on risk reduction is very meaningful, right? So it's like the simple fact of losing weight, reducing overall mortality risk and comorbidity risk and things like that is very, very meaningful, right? And so I think that's an important thing to consider and make sure that like, we take into account. And so I think to your point, if the cost of these medications saves tens, hundreds of billions of dollars a year, like there is a calculus there that starts to make a lot of sense. I think to your question about the supply chain issue, I haven't spent a ton of time looking into this, but I know in 2021 and 2022 there was definitely some difficulties getting access to these, especially dependent on your healthcare provider, your insurance carrier, whether you were in Canada or the U.S. I think a lot of that is going to sort itself out. One, just the fact that as they generate more money, these pharmaceutical companies can, dump more money into producing them. Two, there's trials going on right now that have moved from injectable to oral. And so as they go to oral medications, you have less consumables, shipping becomes cheaper. Um, and so they're going to just be more readily available. And when they're oral, and then it's like, you know, it's a much easier way to get that medication out into the world. So we'll have less supply chain constraints.
That only makes sense. I guess there's a lot of outrage about celebrities using it and popularizing it for cosmetic reasons and maybe not necessarily being transparent about it. Do you even care if people are transparent about why they've lost the weight? Uh,
I mean, one, I think if we're looking to Hollywood celebrities as our moral guiding light, we're in trouble anyway. I mean, two, like uh substance use, whether it's weight loss medications or steroids in Hollywood to like look perfect for whatever they're doing is not new. Like this is not novel. I mean, this has been culture since like Hollywood was the thing in the 1950s. So this is not new territory.
Good. All right. You threw one more thing at me, and I wanted you to define what you meant by the industry bullwhip in the context of this massive push online. I mean, obviously, the pandemic accelerated the living hell out of that. We saw the common saying is like 10 years of progress on a lot of things in 6 months. But now it seems that we're seeing more of a pivot back to the in-person stuff again. What's driving that? What's going on?
Yeah, what's driving it, I think, is people just going back to normal life. I think that's a big part of it. Um, basically what we've seen is there was a massive shift to going online in the pandemic. And we're now at the point where like US gym traffic, like people actually going into gyms, is now at slash above pre-pandemic levels, which is interesting, right? So it went down dramatically. And I think the last report I saw somebody sent to me was we are now at about 15% above what gym traffic was prior to the COVID pandemic. So that's super interesting. The data on like in-person personal training is that it's going up. Um, so in-person personal trainers are starting to have higher client loads, and the online space is being affected the most. What's really difficult about the data here to really understand is we have to kind of use proxies for like online coaching because there's not great data because we don't have outside of Noom and Weight Watchers, which Weight Watchers is a whole different story. We don't have great data on like what the average online coach's portfolio or look like because there's only a handful of like medium to large online nutrition companies and they're all private. So their data is not easily accessible, right? Like us, Stronger You, they're all private companies. So like their books aren't open. You don't know how many clients they have, what the average revenue per client is. So we don't have great. So we have to look to places like Noom and Peloton, for like these online health beach body, and they're all down substantially. I mean, revenues are down 30, 40, 50, 60, 80% depending on the business, which is massive. Oh, I think you're muted.
I'm sorry, I was muted. Do you think it could be that people are going and seeking out more individualized coaches, personalities? They're not gravitating to the big brand anymore. They're going to the online coach, the online influencer, whether highly qualified or not, but people that they have a para-social relationship with and they just like want to identify with, or someone that is a highly engaged person on their social media. Do you think some of this could be explained by a shift within how they're consuming online?
Yeah, so I actually think there's two things going on. One is um, a lot of what you mentioned, and I think it's due to, I mean, I love our users in this industry. I love our clients. They're amazing, but they're also super fickle, right? Like they will bounce from thing to thing to thing to thing, right? And it's whatever worked for me today. If it's not working for me anymore, whether it's they're not doing it right or they've just reached a new place in their life, whatever, they're going to jump to the next thing. So I think a lot of it is a lot of people have gone through whatever they were using during COVID. It's been what, 4 years? They've kind of probably just petered out whatever their interest is in that, and now they're going to something else. And I think to your point is these kind of micro influencers, smaller brands are what's taking most of this attention. I think the other piece is the age demos are starting to phase out in cohorts, right? So like we now have like all those people who were in their mid 30s during COVID are now in their mid 40s or their early 40s, right? So now we have all the kids who were 22 during COVID are now 27. So they're starting to reach into that peak demographic. So you've just got age cohorts also phasing through brands and things like that. So I think that's really also what's going on.
I suppose this kind of ties back to AI's potential, where the quote micro influencer versus the big brand like a Peloton has the ability to theoretically scale the way that they deliver, one to many programs. I mean, I have no AI incorporated into any of my business at this stage. And to kind of go back to the ethical thing is I will never use AI to do anything. Like there are a few things for me. Rules. Number one is communicating with people on social media. It's always me, right? I'm sending voice and video messages. People know it's me. Like AI may eventually get to that point.
I say you're not deep faking your podcasts.
No, exactly, right? So any of my content creation, so if I'm writing articles, if funny, we're talking about strength training, weight loss, and everything. I literally published today as a recording on my website an article about all this stuff. If you guys want to read it, like Brad, I will literally send it to you. I think you'll really like it.
Perfect.
But anybody listening, please like just message me. I think you'll love this. So that's me writing stuff. There's no AI going into that. I just simply can't, right? And I think as someone who I'm very proud of the fact that I'm an established writer in the industry over and above what most people are, because now everybody kind of just like quick form, short form social media. That's where their content creation goes. So I think you can actually differentiate on long form, good quality media, especially writing, because podcasting, jump on mics, two people talk, blah, 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 whatever. Writing takes time, effort to make really, really good stuff. And so I want to stand out in that realm. So I will never replace any of my content creation with AI, and I certainly won't do it in communications. How do you feel about things like, I think it's ManyChats, and I've got some friends who use it. And what I have a little trouble with is if a chat bot, if you're not really transparent about the fact that you're using a chat bot and people think they're interacting with you. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I probably to my own detriment, I just default to being as transparent as possible. I mean, like we have used many chat, but it's always like it's very clear that's what it is, right? It's sort of like, hey, how do I use it as like a self-service kiosk of like, oh, are you interested in coaching? Do you want this free ebook? Like, what are you here for? And it like guides them down to a path that's like, oh, do you really want to talk to a person now? I think that's how those tools should be used. I struggle with the inauthentic approach of like, hey, let me just pretend like I'm someone I'm not. I think in some industries that makes sense. I think in an industry like ours, where what we're really trying to do is connect with people and understand like how do we help people. I think if you lead with just not telling people what's actually happening, it's really not doing a service to the clients, and that's ultimately what we're here at the end of the day for.
there's something really important within all this too. And I was on a podcast. I don't know if you saw this graphic that I posted up. It's me being interviewed by a Muppet, an actual Muppet.
That's awesome.
Anyway, it's a great YouTube video. Anybody who wants to watch it, it's hysterical. About 30 minutes. I will send it to you. It's funny as hell. It's Brick Head. I think it's Headstrong. But I go into the whole topic of AI, and this is really important to understand. People will self-select one of two ways. They will
Yeah.
self-select to the real human interaction, where we've been digital for a while. They're now going back to analog. So I like I've been collecting vinyl. I just love the experience of listening to records in an age of, hey, you can stream everything. There is going to be a shift back there for a lot of people who still want that one-on-one human experience. I think if you are turning around and trying to recreate that without doing the work by using AI, I think that's really, really bad news. But if you want to incorporate scalable AI type stuff, there's a lot of people who actually want to self-select to the ease of use, either quick and dirty of app. People are going hardcore into apps. I mean, what do we have? We have you guys probably have some sort of app access to your coaching as well. I know it's a lot of it's human coaching. RP are aggressively scaling their apps. Lane has had Carbon Diet app for quite a while. There's a whole bunch of this sort of stuff going on in the industry. And the analogy I said on this podcast, which just gets kind of ridiculous, is when like the human interpersonal romantic relationship, right? Okay, messy, complicated human to human stuff. So what have people been doing for a really long time? Self-selecting to the 80s, they're like calling into sex chat lines. Okay. And I use the example of the music video for Sweet Emotion by Aerosmith. If you're not familiar with this video, you need to go see it and watch to the very end. And he's talking to this sultry voiced sex caller, and then it shows a silhouette of this bombshell girl. And at the very end, it pivots, and the girl hanging up is an obese woman, not what you would call. It's not the same image, and she's just putting on this voice. And I think now what do we get? We're going to see AI fake. I mean, I see this stuff on social media already for OnlyFans girls. So what are people going to do? There are guys who have literally married like their sex dolls. Okay. So what's going on here? People are actually willfully choosing to interact with something that is controlled, that they can dictate all of the parameters of the interaction. And it sounds like a ridiculous analogy, but it's a very, very poignant one in that some people want to interact with something that's controlled and not necessarily the messy, complicated relationship of a person. Sometimes it's low friction of an app, but sometimes they just don't want messy people. But then there's all these other people I think are going the other way, that they want the real human interaction and the messiness of it that comes with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've kind of described the bimodal nature of people, right? Is people want no friction and they want the easy path, right? Or there's people who will kind of search out whatever it's gonna require to get them to where they want to go, right? Like we've all had clients who like you can have the hard conversation with, like you can kind of call them out. You're like, hey, like what are you doing, right? You're not following through on anything we've discussed. Like you're clearly not like actually interested in doing this. Like what's going on? Let's have a conversation. And then there's some clients who like you can't even mention a negative thing to them, or they just like run for the hills, right? Like we've all had those types of clients, and I think it's you know what you described is how do you capture one of those kind of
Mm,
bimodal groups of people, and then the other side is how do you capture the other.
absolutely. And that's exactly it. I mean, I think there's opportunities on both sides of that coin. Um, I think some of the big players who have more resources to put into things. I've had several guests on recently where one of the topics was like the fact that they had an app. It just worked out that way. I just had my friend Steve Keen out of the UK, and he's been developing an app, and he had a monstrous surge of social media following, the fastest I've ever seen. And so the app made sense given the potential scale of users that were coming in, but also like the development headaches and the cost involved. And this is something that came up with Victoria Powell I had on, Sherelle Grant. They described this like most trainers probably do not have the resources, the time to be able to devote to building this sort of thing, or the inbound traffic to be able to actually make it justifiable.
Yeah, I mean, I think let's see. At this point, I've developed 4 apps. I can tell you every single one of them has cost way more than we thought, took way longer than we thought. Um, we had this may be a little too political, but we had so one of the like big themes over the last 5 to 10 years is hiring Ukrainian developers because they're very good and they're very cheap. So we hired a group, and then obviously all the stuff with the Ukraine Russia situation went off, and all of a sudden we couldn't get a hold of our developers. So those kind of things happen, right? But to your point is, unless you have like a very targeted use case for it, unless you have like a very dedicated audience and you have a plan to monetize it immediately, it's going to cost you way more than you think. And unless you have the inbound traffic to like monetize it, it's it the ROI is going to be fairly low for a long time. I mean, you got to think just with the way conversion rates are going, 1% of your audience may convert to buying, right?
Mm.
So you got to think, okay, it's going to cost me 250 grand to develop an app, which is fairly reasonable. If it's robust, like how, and you want to sell it for $1 a pop, like, okay, got to have, you know, a huge amount of traffic to that to pay that off over time. So it's just, to your point, I think that's a big part of it. And then the other piece is like, what app solution is going to change a client's life that hasn't been developed?
And you're trying to do it better than Renaissance Periodization and the resources that they are pumping into it now because their YouTube has been skyrocketing. So guess what? They got resources. I mean, they have brilliant people. I know their team. They have brilliant people behind this stuff who are fully dedicated to this. And you're not going to beat them when it comes to this, right? So I think people need to kind of choose wisely which way they're going to go. And for me, I continue to lean on the side of the personal relationship and being visibly myself. And I just cannot misrepresent, use AI to misrepresent that someone's interacting with me when they're not. So that's my line in the sand. I don't know if everybody shares my feelings on that.
Yeah, and everybody's going to carve a different path, right? I was having this kind of to your point. I was having this conversation when I was in Arizona. I think maybe to the detriment of a lot of people, there's been this just theme of everything has to be about scale and building a big business and exiting it and selling it and retiring on the beach with money. Um, One, that is less than 0.1% of people, right? Two, it's probably not going to work out like you think it's going to work out, like emotionally in your life wise. There's a lot of stuff that comes with things like that that's just not worth it. Three is like realistically to build a long-term career in this space and to make a good living, like let's say you want to do it in the online space, you need maybe 60 to 100 clients at most, right? So if you spend 3, 4 years just like diligently doing a great job coaching people, being semi-active on the internet, building an email list, selling occasionally, and you have low churn rates, like within 3 to 5 years, you'll have a client roster that's that size.
Mhm. Yep.
And then sustaining that business by yourself is not like an insurmountable task. Like that seems like a great life.
And I mean, I can speak from experience, and that's been my experience. That has been my literal
Yeah.
experience. And uh, you're right. I noticed probably within the last couple of years, it's actually dying off fairly quickly. But there was this big push from the business mentorships to scale. Like that was a big narrative. And I keep saying this. People have probably heard me say it before. You get these people talking about their 7-figure businesses. Well, they've got 7-figure expenses and 7-figure headaches. And I always joke that I'm the 6-figure coach. And sometimes I'm sitting at 7-figure tables, which, I like being in that space, but my margins are probably better
Way
than
better.
my take home is probably way better than certainly a portion of the people who spent a lot to scale to 7 figures. And you got to ask yourself, why are you going for 7 figures? Is it a status thing? Is it because you thought that's what you're supposed to do? And that level of stress and headache. And I've seen more than a few examples of people who had to pivot. They hit the 7-figure thing and then they ultimately decided to pivot. They couldn't sustain the rate at which they were just burning out. So I just think you're implying, and I'm going to say it explicitly, just be careful of what you're hearing people say, what you should do, and make sure you're just coming at this from like, what do you want to do? What's authentic to you? Don't play status games within this realm, not in our industry.
Yeah, I think the other thing is the the ebbs and flows of just consumer interest, or like be prepared for the up and the down. Like you might have years where you do millions of dollars in top line revenue, and then you might have years where you do $12 in top line revenue. Like that's realistic, right? Like look at Peloton, right?
Mm,
They sold every bike that they could produce, and now nobody wants them because they sold through them, right? So it's like just be prepared for just that ride. And I was having a conversation with somebody a couple weeks ago, and they were just kind of asking me for career advice, and they were kind of starting to pick up some popularity. And I said, hey, the first thing you can do for the longevity of your career is set up your personal financial life so you can do this for a long time. Like if you make $1 million this year, live like you've made 100 grand this year, because next year you could have zero. And if you set up your business and your life up based on the expenses of the best year you've ever had, like all of a sudden you're back to square zero instead of, hey, I now have 8 years of runway in front of me. I can continue to build a good client list over the next 20 years. And so I think a lot of it is just, if this is what you want to do long term, how do you make decisions in your own life to like let you do that?
absolutely. I have no car payment right now. I I didn't upgrade my home. I love my home. I actually was able to stuff a massive gym in the basement. I live in a duplex. I've owned it. I'm just
Yeah.
paying my mortgage. It's the rate's really good. Next renewal will be a little tricky in a year and a half. We'll see how the rates if they come back down, but I'll be fine. So same thing. Okay, I'm out of time. So where can listeners find you?
They can find us. Just go to macrosinc.net. You can find me on Instagram, just Brad Dieter. Facebook, you can find me. Same thing. It's the best place to find me.
Always love talking to you, my friend. Everybody listening, please go check out what Brad's doing and get on a plane. Come hang out with us September 13th, 14th in Edmonton. I've got killer room rates. If you're American or somewhere else in the world, the exchange rate is a beauty, right? At our early bird price on tickets is, I've shifted it. It'll be to the end of July. You
Oh,
can
cool.
watch virtually, take in all the presentations. Brad, I cannot wait to see you. Everybody listening, thank you so much. If you enjoy this conversation, share it with someone who you think would get a lot out of it. I always want to grow and reach more people. Thank you guys.